2.5 years ago, I decided it's time to do something else and not think about security for a while. And I was surprisingly successful at not thinking about security in the last 15 months. So now I'm giving this talk here at a conference for security, having not thought about the topic much in recent months. My solution to coming up with something to say then is take the things I would normally ramble about over beers with people individually and condense them into a talk. It's a bit of the scalable version of having a beer with each of you individually. Right, so this is going to be a rambling talk and a quite personal talk. As you saw in the title is Why I Love Offensive Work and Why I Don't Love Offensive Work. And I think an important part, or an important thing for me to mention about my personality is somebody I worked with once asked, "Hey Halvar, is it not really strenuous to have a love-hate relationship with everything?" And while this isn't precisely true of everything, there's a few things that I actually quite like and a few things that I actually quite unambiguously dislike. It is true that for most things I have a complicated or complex relationship with it. And security is a complex topic, and this keynote is going to be a reasonably personal recap of my complex relationship with security. Because it's a personal talk, I'm quite sure that everybody's personal experiences and opinions will differ, so I think there's going to be plenty to disagree with. We shall see. We shall see. So let me begin with all the reasons, or not all the reasons, but at least 10 reasons why I love offensive work. And there's many good reasons, some of which are technical reasons, some of which are economic reasons, and some of which are emotional reasons. And I'll begin with the technical reasons. And on the technical side, offensive work is awesome because it is so full stack. Meaning, like if anybody talks about full stack engineering, security really is full stack engineering because the security flaws always hide at the borders between abstraction layers. And that means that as a security person, you get to look at all these different abstraction layers. And in some sense, the cynical person would say that the only person in computing that is paid to actually understand the system from top to bottom is the attacker. Everybody else is usually paid to understand their part. So one of the beautiful things about offensive work is you get to play at every abstraction layer, and you get to look at every abstraction layer, and you get paid to actually understand the different abstraction layers. And there's so many of them, and it's fascinating. We're going from the physics of the hardware, the vagaries of the manufacturing process, all the way through the operating system, through libraries, through the implementation, through the high-level logic, through things like Unicode, homoglyph attacks, and so forth, which are really on the very top abstraction layer. Another good technical reason is it's so broad when it comes to the techniques you employ, meaning you've got all these interesting questions of program analysis, stuff like data flow analysis, abstract interpretation, all of these very academic things. When you do exploitation, you get to play with data structures and algorithms at a level that most people never play with them. If you corrupt a pointer in a tree and then have to still insert and remove things from the tree, that's super fascinating. You do a lot of really interesting engineering when it comes to dynamic instrumentation of software. That's really awesome. Systems engineering, like building a big fuzz farm, there's actually a lot of clever systems engineering that goes into it. You can argue that one of the strengths of AFL wasn't the ideas behind it, but the actual engineering of the implementation. You have to deal with systems internals, you get to look at cryptography. That's essentially everything that's cool in computers put into a bowl and you get to play with it. That's awesome. Another thing that's great is spelunking in the ancient ruins of the elders. Software like we build our cities, which means we build on the trash and the ruins of the previous generations, and they're still below where we're living, right? So a lot of software analysis is digging into these old cathedrals that have been built 20 years ago and trying to figure out what they're doing. You sometimes feel like Indiana Jones going into an old code base trying to figure out what's going on. So there's a lot to love on the technical side. Another thing I really, really like is the creativity of vulnerability development. In my trainings classes, I usually tell people that every individual little bug you find is like a random piece out of the IKEA warehouse, and your job is to assemble all these random pieces until you can build a chair out of them. And the vulnerability development process is very much like this. You take all these really weird, oddly shaped bugs, and you try to somehow assemble them into something nice, sturdy, and useful. And that's something I really like. The creative part is not to be underestimated. Then there's another good technical reason, which is offensive work really is on the boundary of what we understand scientifically, in the sense that we're only slowly getting to grips with what it even means on a theoretical level to have an exploit. And it's only in recent years that we've got a reasonable understanding of what memory corruptions really are on the computer science level, and we still don't have a good model for stuff like timing attacks, side channel attacks, and so forth. And that's kind of exciting because there's real new computer science being explored, and we're kind of part of it, and that's exciting. That's cool stuff. There's work there that will possibly survive the next 30, 40 years. Another big technical thing that I love is it's inherently practical, meaning work on offensive technology is by and large not theoretical. I studied cryptography in university, where you get to congratulate yourself if you can lower the theoretical complexity of an attack from 2 to the power of 128 to 2 to the power of 110. Nobody can ever check your work because there's no computer to ever try the 2 to the power of 110. So nobody knows whether it's actually true. And the beauty of offensive work is it's very, very clearly useful in some sense, and it's very, very satisfying to see technology work. And if you're mean, you can say that the offensive side of security is a bit of an outlier within the greater security industry, because the offensive side consistently delivers products that actually do what they advertise. Then there's economic reasons why offensive work is great. Offensive work has almost perfect incentive alignment, meaning your success is almost 100% measurable, and it's discrete. It's either you get the shell or you don't, or either you get code exec or you don't. And technical excellence is strongly correlated with your income because it's so directly measurable. And it sounds weird, but it's super rare in most fields. Like, one of the lies we tell to children is that how good you are at what you do actually matters in terms of your income later. In most industries, that is not true. So offensive work has the nice property of having nice, good, clear alignment of incentives for technical people. The other thing is that most vendors you're attacking kind of care about fighting you, but not really all that much, right? They really care about having their software in everybody's pocket, and they care enough about fighting you to be a nuisance and to be sure that they feel like they've done something, but their business isn't fighting you. Their business is getting that software into everybody's pocket, which means actually that if you have a bug in somebody's software and they don't know about it, their incentives and your incentives are aligned because you want their software to be in everybody's pocket too. The thing is that almost all offensive problems are technical problems, which means it's a great industry to be in if your passion is solving technical problems. Okay, another economic benefit, or a good thing about the economics of offensive, is that what you're selling is actually mission critical for customers. What I say is that the best products are those products that the customer needs in order to do their job. Most security products are nice to haves. Like, no business is going to grind to a halt because they didn't update their antivirus, at least most of the time. And the business can continue without them. And the thing really is, if you sell something that's critical for the client, that the client needs to have, you don't need much of a sales team. If you do sell something that's nice to have, you become a sales-driven product, and then you need to have a large sales team. And this is why we have conferences like RSA, because most security products are sales-driven, because they're not actually essential. And, well, the thing is that those people that actually buy offensive stuff, for these people, it's mission critical to have these things. Like, they need these products to do their job, which means overall, the offensive side is not terribly sales-driven, which also plays into the hands of people that like the technical work. Another economic reason that's a little bit amusing about offensive work is the people that buy offensive products buy these products with other people's money. We have to look at this from, read this diagram from left to right. We've got the device vendor, and the device vendor makes a big investment into making devices harder to hack. Okay, now the cost for the offensive vendor to provide offensive capabilities against this device goes up. So the offensive vendor tells the security apparatus, hey, this has gotten really expensive because the vendor has made these investments. We need more money to do our job. The security apparatus needs more money, but it's not their money. So they go to the politicians and say, hey, we need more money to do our job. The politician then goes to the voter and says, do you want to feel safe? And by and large, voters want to feel safe, and then they're okay with being taxed. So really, the flow of money here is that the offensive vendor gets to tax the population. And the defensive vendor that makes things harder doesn't necessarily actually affect the offensive vendor's bottom line, because the overall revenue of the offensive vendor grows by things getting harder because the sums involved are bigger. And if you assume constant margin, the offensive vendor actually makes more profit as it gets harder to hack things. That's a really, really bizarre setup, and the most bizarre setup is the people that actually decide about giving anybody the money for the offensive tools are so far removed from the actual price negotiation that there's no direct relation. And that is, well, in the end, offensive tools are bought by people that are not spending their own money. Now, there's a whole bunch of emotional reasons why offensive work is interesting. A math professor once told me that the joy in mathematics is often the receding of the pain, which means you work on a really hard problem for a long period of time, and then finally you solve it, and it's super gratifying to push through on a hard problem. And this discrete nature of no success, no success, no success, that's emotionally really powerful, and there's a certain high to it, and it's very, very intense and addictive in some sense. Like I don't think I will ever forget the moment I got double-sided row hammering to work, and I was shaking and had to go for a walk thereafter. And there's a few moments in life where working on a hard problem and suddenly making progress gives you a real push and a real high. And I don't think we should underestimate that a lot of us really like that high. Another emotional reason that I find very powerful is that exploits are really the closest thing to magic spells we have in this world. You have a complicated technological device, and you find out the right incantation to yell at the device to take control of the device. That is as close to magic as you will ever get. And even after 20 years of being involved with exploits, every time I see a good exploit work, I'm like, this is magic. And it is, in some sense. And also that's emotionally very, very powerful. And the last positive reason on the emotional side for me has always been the people. Security, particularly offensive security, used to be a backwater. And most people you met in that region in the early days were primarily motivated by their curiosity, and some of them by a sense of duty. But their overarching ambition wasn't to make the most money. And that led to the offensive community being a very, very interesting community of misfits, often with very, very unique mutant powers, in the sense that different people in offense have very, very different specialties and very different special abilities as well. And I've always found that to be a very, very rewarding experience, because you interact with so many people that are autodidacts, that have taught themselves most of what they know, and that have a real passion for learning. And as somebody who likes being around people that like learning, that's always been very, very, very important for me. All right. Now, after talking about all the things that I love about security, I'll make a few detours, 3 of them in total. And the first one is talking about the question of how do you interact as a scientist with the world, especially when your science interacts with warfare. And why do I talk about this? Well, to some extent, I perceive myself as a scientist and engineer of sorts. And as a teenager, I read Dürrenmatt's The Physicists, and I watched a play called Copenhagen in my late teens. And both of these plays explore the interplay between science, warfare, and the greater societal implications. If you haven't read either, I recommend reading both or watching a play for both. They're absolutely hilarious, fascinating, and worth looking at. And my personal background is that my family is, like, both my parents went through the Second World War, and there's a strong pacifist perspective in that family. But my extended family has a lot of people that actually serve in the military somewhere. So my direct family is very pacifistic, and I had to deal a lot with the question of why am I making my living from essentially the intelligence and military budgets, essentially from age 19 onwards. So I always thought about how does my work relate to these things. And as somebody of almost age 40, clearly I was 14 when the Prodigy released their album, where at the beginning of the sample, I need to take my work back underground to stop it falling to the wrong hands, yada, yada, yada. As an impression-able teenager, you hear that sample, and you can't ever get it out of your head entirely. So I read about these things, and I thought about these things, and I stumbled across a few weird examples. There's a fascinating book called called A Mathematician's Apology by a mathematician called Hardy, published in 1940, where he explores how the sciences have been subjugated to producing ever more vicious war fighting, looking at the experience of World War I and so forth. And he then concludes that luckily, theoretical mathematicians and theoretical physicists are safe because no one has yet discovered any warlike purpose to be served by the theory of numbers or relativity. And it seems very unlikely that anyone will do so for many years. Now, we're speaking, like he wrote this 5 years before Hiroshima. And it was about 25 years, 30 years before RSA was invented. But the point is that what he deemed to be the most pure, the most untouchable and useless of sciences ended up being very, very critical very soon thereafter. A second example is, in the early 2000s, I dated a social anthropologist, and she always made vicious fun of the fact that all of computer science and mathematics is thoroughly militarized and financed by the state to essentially suppress people. She wasn't wrong in some sense, but then the weird thing happens that in 2007, during the Iraq War, Secretary of Defense Gates starts the Human Terrain System, where the DoD hired a whole bunch of social anthropologists to unravel the tribal structure in Iraq to better wage war. Right. So the conclusion you can draw, or may draw from this is, it's really, really difficult for the scientist involved in the moment to predict what the effects of the work that he does will be. Like, it's essentially impossible for me to say what I do will not have military applications or what I do will have military applications. The reality is that the militaries will use whatever is useful in war. And the only way to prevent your work from ever being used for military purposes is make sure it's irrelevant or wrong or both. So in warfare, both sides will take whatever is useful and try to use it. Now, while this may be true, that does not absolve the individual from making informed choices about what he works on and why he works on it. Meaning, you have very limited ability to see what is going to happen to your work. That doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to look. Okay. Next detour. Science and conflict. Is it immoral to improve weaponry? We generally lead discussions from a perspective of saying better weapons are always bad. And for me, an important input to this discussion was in 2016, I visited Japan and both Hiroshima and Tanegashima. Now, I will not talk about Hiroshima. The only thing I can say that is if anybody has a chance of visiting Hiroshima and the museum there, do it. Now, Tanegashima. Tanegashima is an island in the south of Japan, and why is Tanegashima important? It is the place where guns came to Japan for the first time. Japan didn't have guns, and then at some point, during a vicious civil war that had lasted for more than 70 years already, where entire generations of young men had died, a team of, or a small boat with a few Portuguese people with guns landed or stranded on Tanegashima. And they sell their gun to the local warlord. And the local warlord gives that gun to his blacksmith to make copies of the gun. So Japan is essentially at about 80 years into a vicious civil war. The first gun arrives, and then it takes a while for the gun to actually be adopted. The Japanese had trouble with some of the blacksmithing at the beginning. And then it gets fully adopted around 1575, and then the war is over reasonably quickly thereafter, because one side had an advantage to just kill the others and win. So in essence, what we have here is we have 110 years of war, ended relatively quickly by the arrival, or within 40 years, ended by the arrival of superior weaponry. And that's a really strange thing to contemplate. On the right-hand side is a picture I took in the museum there. The Japanese, after they had the first gun, did a whole bunch of very, very weird experimentation with what is actually a good gun. As you see, this is a handgun with a caliber like this, and you have to fire it kneeling down and then roll backwards to deal with the recoil. So the question that I cannot answer is whether superior weaponry is actually always bad. Because what is bad is prolonged warfare where nobody can get an upper hand for generations. And it may be that superior weaponry ends wars more quickly. And it's also like, you could, if you wanted, argue that nuclear weapons have maintained peace because they're so terrible. We don't know. I don't have an answer. And I think about Tanegashima, and I have no good conclusion to draw from it outside of, this is puzzling. There's also counterexamples. When the same thing happened in New Zealand and the first guns arrived, the experience was very, very different. The Maori waged really, really bad war on each other very quickly thereafter with mass casualties without ever having one side gain the upper hand. So we have two examples where the same thing happened and with very different outcomes. It's also interesting to contemplate that Japan ended up entirely disarming itself again thereafter, after they had acquired peace. They gradually rejected guns and even forgot how to make them up until 1800. It's super fascinating. There's a great book called Giving Up the Gun that tries to trace what the heck happened in Japan, that they decided to reject guns as a thing and then even forget how to make them. Anyhow, I don't know what the lesson is, except that saying that weapons are always bad isn't quite the right level of discourse. Okay, third detour, the fragility of democracies. Now, during my travels in 2015, I visited a whole bunch of countries, and at some point I realized, and my wife and me would realized, almost every place we had visited, had living memory of death squads. And many of these places are not places that you immediately associate with living memory of death squads. But let's start with France. During the Algerian War, the French Secret Service disappeared people in Algeria and pioneered a technique later taken up by the Argentinians called death flights, where you just make sure that people disappear by you taking them on a flight over the sea and dumping them there. No corpse ever shows up, people are just gone. Morocco had more than 740 disappearances under King Hassan II, assassinated people in Paris. Uruguay arrested 20% of its population at one point under the dictatorship. Argentina had 30,000 people disappear. South Africa had very, very well-documented torture and assassination infrastructure during the late days of apartheid, which targeted their own civil society. Like lawyers that were arguing against arbitrary detention got killed. Portugal under Salazar disappeared people. Spain had more than 100,000 dead under Franco's White Terror. 100K disappeared in the following years. Taiwan had people disappear. It's just that almost every country has death squads within living memory. There's still people alive that were alive when that happened. And it's something we need to remember. Democracies and basic rights are super fragile, and they're not the norm. And every democracy is about 2 terror strikes and 1 opportunist away from a dictatorship. The other thing is, empirically, state-sponsored death squads happen, and they happen with regularity. And all of us have grown up at a particularly, surprisingly peaceful point in history in a peaceful area of the world. And that tends to bias our judgment of what's happening. Meaning, we've only experienced peace and we've only experienced rights. And it's very, very important to keep in mind that that is not everybody's experience, and it's also historically an anomaly, and we don't know whether it'll last. All right, so let's talk about the issues I have where I don't particularly love offensive work. I talked a lot about the reasons why I love offensive work. Now, there's some societal reasons why I don't love offensive work. There's some emotional reasons, and there's some technical reasons. The societal reasons, the very first one, and perhaps the most important one for me, is the question for whom. And about 20 years ago, I first met Robert Morris Sr. And I admire the person when he was alive, and he was a fantastically entertaining person to chat with. And at some point, he asked me what I do. And I had just started at university studying mathematics, so I told him I study math. And his answer was, for whom? And I found that very confusing to be, like, for me, I go to university, for whom? And this question for whom is one that is actually surprisingly important for all of security, because we have to realize that all of security is fundamentally about human conflict. Doing security, you're always on somebody's side. And this holds true for both offensive work and defensive work. And the reality is that if you're on somebody's side and get paid, you're usually on the side of the powerful, because the powerful usually have the money to pay people. So one of the things that I find difficult with all of security is you always pick a side, and I'm sometimes running out of sides that I want to pick. The second societal reason why offensive work can be disappointing is there's essentially 3 big career paths on the offensive side, and they all have different downsides. Option 1 is the government agency, where you get to directly work on the problems and the operations and so forth. And the positive is this is impactful work, you have some insight in what's happening with your work, and so forth. There's a lot of cons to this, though. The pay is relatively low. There are a lot of quite onerous restrictions on your travel, on your interaction with foreigners, your ability to work from home, and so forth. There's career advancement mostly at the expense of actually doing technical work, where you have to become a managerial person in order to advance. And increasingly, you may end up not doing the technical work, but just manage contractors that then provide you with services. So that's one option, not everybody's option. You can go to an offensive vendor, where the salaries are much better, but then the trouble there are the economic incentives, where usually for most offensive players, their profits are maximized when they sell to the scummiest people. Because the scummiest people have difficulty getting these capabilities otherwise, so they are willing to pay the most money for it. Another con working for an offensive vendor is you now work in an organization where top management has an incentive to lie to you. If you look at Hacking Team told their own people, oh yeah, we comply with all these laws and we comply with Wassenaar. What this meant is they had a friend in the Italian ministry that would okay an export to Sudan under Wassenaar. Right? So point is, you may work in an organization where your own management will not tell you the truth or will actively mislead you about what's happening. There's also the con that the international legal protections are unclear in the long run. Alisa couldn't talk here, particularly because she did work that she thought was okay, and then politics changed and there were long-term legal repercussions for her. So that's the legal protection if you are doing this work. Maybe okay now, you don't know what the situation is in 10 years, and you may not know which countries will take offense with your past work. On the defensive vendor side, there's good salaries, or a less good salary, but a lot of flexibility if you do VRPs. There's fewer ethical misincentives, which is both good. But the downside then is you're not business critical, normally, and you're always a cost center, which means if business turns sour, you will be on the list of things to cut. And then there's the emotional side that not everybody loves, which is you get to do vuln research and then kill your creations. Not everybody deals with that similarly well. But all 3 of these options have the individual downsides, and neither of them is perfect. Another reason is that there's a somewhat limited societal value add, in the sense that to some extent, the internet giants have turned themselves into spy agencies. I mean, the explicit reason the Chinese government mentioned for attacking Google back in 2009 was Google is turning itself into the biggest spy agency, and you can cooperate or compromise other spy agencies. Google doesn't cooperate. The vendors have turned themselves into spy agencies. They've convinced the population to pay for their own surveillance gear, which is also awesome. And now the spy agencies want a piece of the pie. So if you ask yourself the question, how does offensive work actually improve the world outside of my own life? The answer may not be terribly good. Like the potential for having a positive impact on 1 million people is limited. I have a diagram here on how this works. We've got the vendors that spend billions to convince people that surveillance, like carrying surveillance devices, is a great idea. You have the population that is convinced that this is a good idea, buys these surveillance devices and provides the data to the vendors. And then you've got the security apparatus on the right-hand side that either pulls the data out of the vendors via legal means or pulls the data right out of the devices via offensive means. You get to pick whether you work for the vendor or the security apparatus. You don't get to pick to work for the population, which is not great. Another emotional reason why offensive work is difficult is everything is so complicated. Meaning, the joy of finding bugs and exploiting them is very pure. It gives me a very, very direct, pure intellectual reward. Every decision thereafter, you can write a bookshelf of moral philosophy PhD theses on the implications, or 20 gigabytes of Twitter ranting. I personally don't enjoy these complications. I like the first part, but everything thereafter I could really live without. Another emotional reason why I find offensive work difficult is there's this saying that it's very difficult to make somebody understand something if their salary depends on not understanding it, which is a short form of saying that if you're economically dependent on something, it by its nature skews your perspective of that something. Like you cannot reason very soberly about something that pays your bills. And at some point I wondered to what extent being part of security distorts my own view. And I was curious to how my view would change if I wasn't economically dependent on security anymore. Right. There's an emotional part which is negative, which means security is often, or offensive security is less accumulative than most other engineering. We stopped really working on BinDiff almost 10 years ago. It's still useful now. It's very rare for offensive tools to have the same lifespan. And if you look back on a long offensive career, it can look like, oh, I found this OpenSSH remote and it's gone. I found this RDP remote and it's gone. I developed this technique for exploiting 2006 KX malloc, that's gone. So even by technology standards, which is reasonably fast moving, offensive technology is particularly ephemeral. Ephemeral, difficult word. Okay, another technical reason why offensive security isn't great is if you maximize the profitability, it's actually really repetitive. Because every new target has a very significant ramp-up cost. Your first Chrome exploit is much more expensive to build than the next 10. And the customers build entire tool chains around a particular technique so that they need swappability of parts. So when one bug dies, they need a precise replacement for that bug, which kind of limits the exploration side to exploitation, meaning you don't get to explore as much because you need to produce to maximize profit the same thing over and over again. So in some sense, you maximize your profits when you also maximize your intellectual stagnation by doing the same thing over and over again. The point 8 is offensive work often turns you into an expert on obsolete technologies. Because obsolete technologies is where the bugs are, and you can argue that there's more people that have a deep understanding of true type font rendering in offensive security than there ever were in typography. By now, that particular area has been read, and it's provided 15 years of remote access. It may provide another 10 years or so, but eventually font rendering will be sandboxed sufficiently that that's not the door you get into anymore, at which point you are the world's expert on a technology that's no longer relevant anyway. The nature of offensive work is that you target mass market tech, which is always a couple years behind emerging tech. Right. Number 9. Missing a big technology transformation. Computing at the moment is changing in a way it hasn't changed in 30 years. The data center-sized computing is emerging. We have prototypical OSs. Nobody's got a clue how to properly architect them. No real debugging exists. The end of Moore restructures the way we build computers and we think about computing. All that is super exciting, but a lot of the offensive work is, hey, can you do another Chrome, please? Or can we have another Safari and a Privesk, please? That kind of feels like it's not the most exciting area. So I see a lot of glum faces. I'm at the last of the 10 negative reasons. I gave 10 positive ones, I give 10 negative ones. The last negative part is what I call the obituary test. Now, my wife calls me Captain Sunshine because I actually enjoy reading obituaries. It's probably my favorite form of literature. And I believe in trying to live your life by reverse engineering your life from the obituary you would like to have. So sit down and think what your obituary should read, and then try to live your life in order to get the obituary you want. And I looked at my imaginary obituary and I was like, there needs to be more than just doing security. And I looked around, and one of my idols, Gerardo Richarte, the man that taught me everything important about heaps, has a very successful post-security career building imaging satellites. And many other of my idols had multiple careers. So at some point I wondered, am I a one-trick pony of sorts? And I felt the need to try to do something else for a while. I mean, I can always return to security if all else fails. But at the moment, staring at my virtual obituary, I was like, okay, this needs a change. So decision on my side was I'm going to do something else for a while, and what I'm going to do now is performance optimization, because it turns out to have a lot of the technical upsides of offensive work, meaning it is full stack, And if you do well, if you're technically competent, you can actually produce really good results for the client. A lot of super interesting technical problems there, and a lot of room for creative solutions. There's a few emotional advantages of all of that. It's really, really nice to not have an ambiguous feeling about the implications of my work just yet. It's also really nice to not have to answer the question for whom so much. And given that security often, or offensive security often has negative externalities for somebody, it's really nice to work on something that has positive externality in the sense that if I do well, my client saves money, I earn money, and we're saving some CO2 because we saved energy consumption that was wasteful in the first place. Another great advantage to no longer doing security is it gives you superiority in Twitter debates, because whenever you argue with somebody that's still in security, you can have the smug superiority of saying, well, your opinion is invalid because you still earn your money with security. I very much appreciate that advantage. It's a bit unclear whether economically all of this will pan out. It's not clear for me how I can start taxing society. If I figure it out, I'll be a happy man. So, summary of my talk. Offensive work is absolutely great, and offensive work is absolutely terrible. And I think we should all be extremely aware of the fragility of democracies and personal rights, and the fact that in all likelihood, any country you work in will have death squads in a 100-year period, at least from what we know so far. And the ethical questions are real and complicated and have no easy answers, and everybody has to answer them individually. Two more messages. Security is really a very, very tiny shard of a very, very much bigger world, and offensive work is a tiny fragment of a much bigger, interesting computational world. And as much as offensive work is fascinating and awesome, there's a lot of stuff outside that's also quite cool. Anyhow, balancing your love for something with your not love for something is often difficult, especially for me. I have no good answers. Enjoy the con.